All right, let's go. Number 10. In the spring of 2011, Dr. Naomi Schweitzer, a hydrogeologist with the Israel Geological Survey, was wading through one of the freshly collapsed sinkholes along the Dead Sea's western shoreline when she felt something that shouldn't have been there. Cold fresh water was rushing past her boots, pooling in the base of the crater at a rate she estimated at several liters per second. She called her field team over. Within the hour, they had documented a freshwater spring emerging from the fractured limestone at the bottom of a sinkhole that had opened less than 3 weeks earlier. The water temperature was 16 degrees Celsius. The salinity reading was negligible. In a basin defined by its hostility to life, fresh water was surfacing unbidden. The Dead Sea has been receding for decades, its surface dropping by roughly 1 meter per year since the mid-1990s. Driven by industrial mineral extraction on both the Israeli and Jordanian sides, and the systematic diversion of the Jordan River's tributaries upstream. The recession has opened more than 6,000 sinkholes along the sea's perimeter since systematic monitoring began. The geology behind the sinkholes is straightforward. As the water table drops, subterranean salt layers dissolve, the ground above them collapses, and craters open. That much is established hydrology. What Schweitzer's team documented over the following 2 field seasons was not. By 2013, her survey had cataloged over a dozen freshwater springs emerging along the western Dead Sea basin between Ein Feshka and Ein Gedi, several with measurable biological activity. Microbial mats, photosynthetic bacterial colonies requiring sustained freshwater exposure, had colonized the margins of at least 4 spring outlets. A follow-up study published in 2016 in the Journal of Hydrology, led by Dr. Itai Gavrieli of the Geological Survey of Israel, reported a finding that forced a second reading. Small freshwater fish, Aphanius dispar, the Dead Sea killifish, were observed swimming in freshwater pools along the shore. Living, reproducing freshwater fish, separated from the most hypersaline body of water on Earth by a boundary of exposed sediment less than 4 meters wide. The salt concentration of the Dead Sea exceeds 340 grams per liter, roughly 10 times the salinity of the ocean. The adjacent freshwater pools measured below 2 grams per liter. The 2 systems are functionally different planets, and the distance between them can be crossed in 3 steps. The text in Ezekiel 47, composed during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, describes water flowing eastward from beneath the temple threshold toward the Araba, the geological rift valley that contains the Dead Sea, and entering the sea. The passage states that the water will heal the sea, that it will teem with great quantities of fish, and that fishermen will stand along its shore from En Gedi to En Eglaim, spreading their nets. En Gedi is a real location on the western shore of the Dead Sea. The freshwater springs Schweitzer's team documented are within 11 kilometers of it. The geological explanation, aquifer destabilization caused by dropping water tables exposing new hydraulic pathways through fractured limestone, is technically sound. No hydrologist disputes the mechanism. What the mechanism does not explain is how a text composed 26 centuries ago described freshwater incursion, biological recovery, and the specific geographic location of a process that modern hydrology only began documenting in 2011. The author of Ezekiel 47 did not have access to groundwater modeling, aquifer dynamics, or any scientific framework that could predict the conditions under which a hypersaline basin would begin producing freshwater springs along its western margin. The springs are still flowing, the fish are still there, the Dead Sea is still dropping, and as it drops, more springs surface. The text named the location. The location delivered exactly what the text described. No one in the relevant institutions has addressed the alignment publicly, and no one appears inclined to. Number 9. In August 2017, a remote sensing analyst at the European Space Agency's Climate Change Initiative in Frascati, Italy, was reviewing multispectral data from the Landsat 8 satellite when she flagged an anomaly across the northern Negev desert in southern Israel. The Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, a standard satellite measure of photosynthetic activity derived from the ratio of near-infrared to visible red reflectance, had been climbing steadily across a region classified as arid to hyperarid since orbital monitoring began in 1972. The anomaly was not localized to an irrigation zone or a single agricultural settlement. It covered an area of approximately 4,600 square kilometers, a footprint larger than the state of Rhode Island. The data was internally consistent, cross-referenced against MODIS satellite archives maintained by NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center and ground truth surveys conducted by the Jacob Blaustein Institutes for Desert Research at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. The trend was unmistakable. Between 1988 and 2017, chlorophyll-bearing surface coverage in the northern Negev had increased by an estimated 32%. Bare soil reflectance signatures were being replaced by vegetative signatures at a rate that Dr. Arnon Carnielli, the head of Ben-Gurion's remote sensing laboratory, described in a 2019 publication in Remote Sensing of Environment as inconsistent with any natural regreening process in an arid zone of this classification. Agricultural land in the broader Negev region had expanded from roughly 23,000 hectares under cultivation in 1985 to over 77,000 hectares by 2018. In a desert where annual rainfall averages 86 millimeters, less than a third of what most cereal crops require, industrial-scale agriculture was not merely surviving, it was expanding. Israel's agricultural export figures support the orbital data. The country exports over $2.5 billion in agricultural products annually, a disproportionate share of which originates in the Negev and the Arava Valley, semi-arid and arid zones that conventional agronomy in the 1940s classified as permanently non-arable. Cherry tomatoes developed at Hebrew University are grown in desert greenhouses. Date palms in the Jordan Valley produce among the highest yields per hectare on Earth. Flower exports to Europe, roses, carnations, orchids, originate in climate-controlled facilities surrounded by sand. The mechanism is well understood. Drip irrigation technology pioneered by Simca Blas in the 1960s, desalinated seawater piped from Mediterranean coastal plants, and crop strains genetically optimized for heat and salinity tolerance. The mechanism is not the point. Isaiah 35, written in the 8th century BCE, describes the desert and the parched land rejoicing, the wilderness blossoming as abundantly as the rose, the glory of Lebanon given to it, the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. Isaiah 27 adds a second specification. Israel will bud, blossom, and fill the face of the world with fruit. The geographic precision of the prophecy. Not a general prediction about global agriculture, but a named territory in a named condition of aridity, producing agricultural abundance sufficient to be noticed by the surrounding nations, is what makes the satellite data difficult to bracket as coincidence. But here's where the standard dismissal, that modern technology explains the phenomenon, fails to account for the evidence. The text did not predict that humans would one day irrigate deserts. It did not predict drip systems or desalination plants or genetically modified seed stock. It specified which desert. It specified that the desert would bloom. It specified that the produce would reach the nations. The author, writing during the late monarchic period of Judah, was describing a region he could see, barren, rain-deprived, hostile to cultivation, and declaring that it would reverse its fundamental character. No climatological model available in the 8th century BCE, no agricultural projection, no precedent in the author's observable world supported the claim. The claim was made anyway. The satellite confirms it from orbit. The NDVI data is publicly archived through the USGS Earth Explorer database. The agricultural export records are published annually by the Israel Central Bureau of Statistics. The Landsat 8 spectral data is freely available to any researcher with an internet connection. The text is in Isaiah 35. The desert is blooming. The author had no scientific, climatic, or technological basis for the prediction, and the prediction is visible from space. Number 8. In the summer of 2021, a fisherman named Qasim al-Hamdan pulled his flat-bottomed boat across a stretch of the Euphrates riverbed near Raqqa, Syria, that had been navigable by small craft 2 years earlier. The water barely reached his shins. Where the current had once run deep enough to submerge a standing man, cracked mud stretched toward both banks in slabs the size of tabletops, and the exposed riverbed revealed the foundation stones of structures that had been submerged for centuries, mud brick walls, fragments of carved basalt, what appeared to be the corner of a ziggurat platform that no living archaeologist had catalogued. The Euphrates is the longest river in Western Asia. It originates in the Armenian highlands of eastern Turkey, runs 2,780 kilometers through Syria and Iraq, and empties into the Persian Gulf through the Shat al-Arab waterway. For roughly 10,000 years, it was the hydrological spine of Mesopotamian civilization, the river of Babylon, of Ur, of Sumer and Akkad. Its annual flood cycle governed the agricultural calendar of every empire that rose along its banks. Its name appears in Genesis 2 as one of the 4 rivers of Eden. It is the most symbolically and hydraulically significant watercourse in the biblical record. The river has been in decline for over a decade, but the acceleration since 2020 has been without modern precedent. Turkey's Southeastern Anatolia Project, known by its Turkish acronym GAP, is a network of 22 dams and 19 hydroelectric plants controlling the Euphrates headwaters. The system is among the largest hydraulic engineering projects on Earth. Between 2020 and 2023, downstream flow into Syria dropped by an estimated 40%, according to measurements published by the Syrian Water Resources Ministry and corroborated by satellite altimetry data from the Grace-Fo mission operated jointly by NASA and the German Aerospace Center. The Grace-Fo gravity measurements show total water mass in the Tigris-Euphrates basin declining at a rate of approximately 34 cubic kilometers per year, a volume roughly equivalent to the entire capacity of Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, being subtracted annually. In portions of Iraq's Anbar and Diyarbakir provinces, the river narrowed to widths that local hydrologists described as seasonal stream levels. In some stretches, less than half its historical median breadth. Lake Assad, Syria's largest freshwater reservoir, dropped to approximately 35% capacity by mid-2022. The marshlands of southern Iraq, the vast wetlands once covering nearly 20,000 square kilometers, an area larger than Kuwait, the landscape widely identified with the biblical Garden of Eden, have contracted to less than a quarter of their 1970s extent. The Iraqi Ministry of Water Resources reported in 2022 that over 7 million date palms along the Euphrates corridor had died or were dying due to salinization caused by reduced freshwater flow. The agricultural collapse along the river has displaced an estimated 1.3 million people since 2019. Revelation 16 describes the sixth angel pouring out a bowl upon the great river Euphrates, and the water of the river drying up. The text does not describe a seasonal fluctuation. It does not describe a temporary drought. It describes a named river, by name explicitly, the Euphrates, the only river identified in the passage, losing its water. The standard geopolitical explanation attributes the decline to Turkish dam infrastructure, regional drought intensified by anthropogenic climate change, and upstream agricultural diversion. All three factors are documented. All three are real. What they do not address is the textual precision. The author of Revelation, writing on the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea in the late 1st century CE, selected one river from every body of water in the known world and described its drying. Not the Nile, which has been dammed but maintains its flow. Not the Tigris, which shares the same basin but is not named. Not the Jordan, the river most central to the biblical narrative. The Euphrates. The author chose the Euphrates, and the Euphrates is the river that is drying, at a rate that satellite gravity measurements can quantify and that fishermen in Raqqa can feel under their boots. The Grace-Fo data is published through NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. The Turkish dam flow records are monitored by the International Commission on Large Dams. The ruins that Al-Hamdan saw emerging from the retreating riverbed have not been formally surveyed. The security situation in Raqqa province has prevented systematic archaeological access since 2013. The water continues to drop. The structures continue to surface. The text named the river. The river is complying. Number 7. In the spring of 2019, Dr. Stefan Hauser of Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich completed a comprehensive photogrammetric survey of the ancient city of Babylon, located approximately 85 kilometers south of Baghdad in the alluvial plains of central Iraq. Hauser's team spent 14 months on site, deploying aerial drones fitted with multispectral cameras and ground-penetrating radar units across a survey area of 1,050 hectares, the largest systematic archaeological assessment of Babylon since the German excavations led by Robert Koldewey between 1899 and 1917. Koldewey had spent 18 years uncovering the Ishtar Gate, the processional way, and the massive fortification walls of Nebuchadnezzar II's capital. Hauser's team was not there to excavate. They were there to answer a simpler question. What is the current condition of the site, and who, if anyone, lives there? The primary finding was notable for what it did not show. Across the full extent of the ancient city footprint, a perimeter that once enclosed an estimated population of 200,000, making it the largest city on Earth in the 6th century BCE. There was no permanent modern habitation. None. No houses, no shops, no infrastructure, no residents. This is not for lack of opportunity. Babylon sits in the Euphrates River Valley, in one of the most fertile agricultural zones in Iraq. The surrounding Babel Governorate supports a population of over 2 million Villages, towns, and agricultural settlements press up against the boundaries of the ancient site on every side, some within 100 meters of the outer walls. The land inside the perimeter is arable. The water table is accessible. The transportation infrastructure of the modern governorate passes directly adjacent. The real estate is, by every conventional metric, usable. But no one lives there. No one has lived there in a permanent, continuous capacity since the city's final decline in the early centuries of the Common Era. The modern history of attempted reconstruction makes the emptiness more striking. Saddam Hussein launched a rebuilding project in 1983, investing an estimated $500 million in state funds to reconstruct the walls of Nebuchadnezzar's palace on the original foundations. Bricks stamped with Hussein's name were laid atop bricks stamped with Nebuchadnezzar's name, a deliberate parallel intended to cast the Iraqi dictator as the heir of Babylon's imperial legacy. The southern palace was partially rebuilt. A modern palace was constructed on an artificial hill overlooking the site. The Gulf War of 1991 halted the project. The 2003 invasion ended it permanently. Between 2003 and 2004, a U.S. military base, Camp Alpha, was established on a portion of the site, and its construction caused documented archaeological damage, including the digging of trenches through unexcavated strata. The base was dismantled. The reconstruction was never resumed. Hussein's modern palace stands empty on its hill, unoccupied, overlooking ancient ruins that are equally unoccupied. Jeremiah 51, composed in the 6th century BCE, states that Babylon will sink and not rise, that it will become a desolation among the nations. Isaiah 13, composed in the 8th century BCE, declares that Babylon will be overthrown like Sodom and Gomorrah, that it will never be inhabited, that no Arab will pitch a tent there, that no shepherd will make his flock lie down there. Jeremiah 51 adds a further specification: Babylon's stones will not be taken for a cornerstone, nor its stones for foundations, a detail that Hauser's survey specifically confirmed, noting that unlike virtually every other major ruin in Mesopotamia, Babylon's ancient building materials have not been systematically quarried for secondary construction in the surrounding settlements. At other sites, Nineveh, Ctesiphon, local populations scavenged ancient cut stone for centuries. Babylon's stones remain in place. The reason has never been adequately explained. Consider the magnitude of the textual claim. The prophecy did not predict that Babylon would be conquered. Every major city in the ancient Near East was conquered at some point. It did not predict that Babylon would be destroyed. Destruction was the baseline expectation for any city in that era. The text predicted that Babylon would never be rebuilt, never re-inhabited, that its construction materials would not be recycled. This is a prophecy of permanent negation, not a single event, but an ongoing condition that must remain true across every subsequent century for the prophecy to hold. One rebuilding, one settlement, one sustained inhabitation would falsify it. Damascus has been continuously inhabited for over 4,000 years. Jerusalem has been destroyed and rebuilt at least twice. Rome endures. Athens endures. Cairo, Aleppo, Byblos, Jericho, every major city of the ancient Near East and Mediterranean either persists or was replaced by a successor settlement on the same site. Babylon alone remains empty, the most powerful dictator in modern Iraqi history, commanding the full resources of a petroleum state, spent $500 million attempting to reverse the condition described in the text. The condition held. The reconstruction failed. The dictator's palace sits abandoned on a hill overlooking ruins that have been uninhabited since before the fall of Rome. The text said it would be so. 26 centuries have confirmed it, 1 year at a time, without interruption, and the confirmation continues this morning. Number 6. On September 15th, 2022, a chartered cargo flight from Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport touched down at Ben Gurion International Airport outside Tel Aviv, carrying 5 red Angus heifers in climate-controlled livestock containers. The animals were approximately 5 months old, had been raised on a ranch outside Comanche, Texas, and had been selected from a herd of over 2,000 head after individual inspection by a team that included American cattle ranchers, a veterinary specialist from Texas A&M, and rabbinical authorities from the Temple Institute in Jerusalem, who had traveled to Texas specifically for the evaluation. The selection criteria were not agricultural, they were not genetic, they were liturgical. Numbers 19 prescribes a purification ritual centered on the preparation of a red heifer, a cow that is entirely red, without a single white or black hair numbering more than 2 on its entire body, that has never worn a yoke, never been used for labor, and is without blemish or defect. The animal is to be slaughtered outside the camp, burned completely, skin, flesh, blood, and dung, along with cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet yarn. The resulting ashes, mixed with fresh water, produce what the text calls the waters of purification, the substance required to ritually cleanse anyone who has come into contact with a human corpse. Without this purification, no priest can achieve the state of ritual purity necessary to serve in the temple. Without ritually pure priests, no temple service can begin. The red heifer is not symbolic. It is not devotional. It is a logistical prerequisite, the first item on a procedural checklist that has not been completed in nearly 2,000 years. The Mishnah, the compiled oral law finalized around 200 CE, records that only 9 red heifers were prepared in all of Jewish history, 2 under Moses, 1 under Ezra, and 6 across the remaining centuries of temple operation through the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE by the Roman general Titus. Maimonides, writing in the 12th century in his commentary on the Mishnah, added a theological note that has echoed across subsequent centuries of rabbinical discussion. The 10th red heifer would be prepared by the King Messiah. The weight assigned to the 10th heifer is not peripheral to Jewish eschatology. It is architecturally central. Rabbi Azariah Ariel, a senior member of the Temple Institute's Halakhic Oversight Committee, inspected the 5 heifers upon their arrival at Ben Gurion and confirmed that at least 3 met the initial eligibility requirements. Uniformly red coat, with no more than 2 non-red hairs visible on the entire body, no history of bearing a yoke, and no blemish that would disqualify them under the Levitical criteria. The animals were transported to an agricultural facility near the biblical site of Shiloh in Samaria, where they have been maintained under continuous rabbinical observation. Daily inspections for the appearance of disqualifying hairs, abnormal markings, or physical defects. The observation protocol is documented, time-stamped, and reviewed by a panel of rabbinical authorities specializing in the laws of purity. In March 2024, the Institute announced that the heifers had reached the age of ritual eligibility, approximately 2 years old, and that inspections were ongoing to determine whether any of the animals remained fully qualified. The announcement generated international media coverage, diplomatic tension. Palestinian Authority officials publicly condemned the preparations as a provocation, and theological debate within both Jewish and Christian eschatological communities. The physical reality beneath the debate was less ambiguous. The animals were real, the inspections were real, the rabbinical protocols were being followed to the letter of a text written over 3,000 years ago. What makes this entry distinct from religious aspiration or theological symbolism is the infrastructure that surrounds the cattle. The Temple Institute has not merely acquired heifers, it has constructed the ritual framework around them. The stone altar for the burning has been designed to the specifications in Numbers 19. The cedar wood has been sourced, the hyssop has been identified and cultivated. The scarlet yarn, dyed with a specific crimson pigment derived from a scale insect, as specified in the Talmudic commentary, has been prepared. The priestly garments for the officiating priest have been completed. The candidate priests have been identified and are in training. The truly unsettling dimension is not the cattle, it is the convergence of prerequisites. For the first time in approximately 2,000 years, every physical component the text specifies for the purification ritual, the qualifying animals, the raw materials, the liturgical knowledge, the candidate priests, the ritual vessels, the geographic proximity to Jerusalem, exists simultaneously, not as theological aspiration, not as future planning, as present tense inventory, stored, maintained, and inspected according to a protocol that has not been operationally relevant since the Roman siege of 70 CE. The heifers stand in a field outside Shiloh. The inspections continue. The altar design is finalized. The preparations described in Numbers 19 are not being studied as history. They are being executed as procedure. The text prescribed a sequence. The sequence is in motion. The clock it runs on is biological. The window of eligibility for the heifers is finite, and the window has not yet closed. Number 5. In October 2016, Dr. Lena Sinjob, a conflict damage assessor contracted by UNITAR's Operational Satellite Applications Program, known as UNISAT, opened a batch of high-resolution commercial satellite images covering the eastern suburbs of Damascus, Syria. The images had been captured by the World View, 3 satellite operated by Maxar Technologies at 31 centimeter ground sample distance, precise enough to distinguish individual vehicles from rubble, standing walls from collapsed walls, and intact rooflines from buildings that had lost their upper stories to bombardment. What the images showed across the neighborhoods of Daraya, Moadamieh, and the eastern Ghouta enclave was structural damage so comprehensive that Sinjab's assessment team had to develop a new classification category. The existing 4-level damage scale used by UNAS, minor, moderate, severe, and destroyed, was insufficient to describe what had occurred. Entire city blocks had been reduced to a condition the team internally designated ground-level erasure, in which no vertical structure remained above foundation height across contiguous areas exceeding 400 meters in any direction. From orbit, these zones were indistinguishable from undeveloped land. Damascus is not merely old. It is, by the consensus of most archaeologists who have worked in the Barada River Basin, one of the 2 or 3 oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. Excavations at Tel Ramad, on the outskirts of modern Damascus, have produced evidence of permanent settlement dating to approximately 10,000 BCE, the pre-pottery Neolithic period, when most human populations were still nomadic. The city has been occupied without interruption through Amorite, Aramean, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Hellenistic, Roman, Byzantine, Umayyad, Abbasid, Ayyubid, Mamluk, Ottoman, and French Mandate periods. It survived the Assyrian conquest of 732 BCE. It survived the Mongol sack of 1260. It survived the Timurid devastation of 1401. It survived Ottoman sieges, European bombardment, and 20th century political upheaval. No catastrophe in its 12,000-year history erased entire districts to foundation level. The Syrian Civil War did. By 2018, the United Nations estimated that approximately 45% of Damascus's pre-war housing stock had sustained damage classified as moderate or worse. In the eastern suburbs, the areas Sinjab's team assessed, the figure exceeded 80%. The population of Greater Damascus, which stood at roughly 4.7 million in the 2010 census, dropped to an estimated 2.8 million by 2017. Neighborhoods that had been continuously inhabited for centuries, in some cases millennia, were rendered uninhabitable by a combination of barrel bombing, tunnel warfare, chemical weapons deployment, and sustained artillery bombardment lasting in areas of eastern Ghouta more than 4 consecutive years without ceasefire. The Yarmouk refugee camp within Damascus's municipal boundaries was reduced to rubble so complete that the UNHCR described it as the deepest circle of hell. Isaiah 17, composed in the 8th century BCE during the late Assyrian period, opens with a declarative statement: Damascus will cease to be a city and will become a heap of ruins. The Hebrew is not ambiguous. The word used, mapala, denotes a collapsed heap of building material, the architectural debris of a structure that has lost its form. The passage does not describe temporary occupation or cyclical conquest. It describes a categorical transformation from functioning city to ruin pile. The passage continues in verses 2 and 3, describing the cities of Aroer as abandoned to flocks, with no one to make them afraid, and declaring that the fortress will disappear from Ephraim and the kingdom from Damascus. The text does not describe a siege that will be lifted. It describes a diminishing, a city that stops being what it was. The destruction was not limited to conventional warfare. On August 21, 2013, a sarin gas attack struck the Ghouta agricultural belt on the outskirts of Damascus, killing an estimated 1,400 people, according to U.S. intelligence assessments, the deadliest chemical weapons attack anywhere on Earth since Saddam Hussein's Halabja massacre of 1988. A United Nations inspection team led by Dr. Ake Sellström of Sweden confirmed the use of sarin bearing surface-to-surface rockets. The attack struck a civilian population that was already under siege, already starving, already being shelled daily. The chemical weapon did not cause the destruction of Damascus. It marked the point at which the destruction crossed a threshold that the modern world had spent decades constructing legal and moral frameworks to prevent. Damascus crossed it anyway. The most disturbing element of this alignment is not the destruction itself. Wars have destroyed cities throughout recorded history. The disturbing element is the specificity of the selection. Isaiah 17 does not generalize. It does not declare that the cities of the nations will fall. It names one city, Damascus. It selects the oldest continuously inhabited city on Earth, the city that survived every previous catastrophe in the archaeological record, and singles it out for a destruction so total that it will cease to function as a city. The author did not choose Jerusalem, which was destroyed by Babylon and by Rome. He did not choose Samaria, the capital of his northern rival. He did not choose Tyre or Sidon or any of the coastal cities within his geographic awareness. He chose Damascus, the city that had never been uncities, and described it becoming a ruin heap. The satellite damage assessments from UNOSAT are publicly accessible through the United Nations Institute for Training and Research. The damage classification methodology, the geolocation data, and the comparison imagery are archived and time-stamped. The rubble fields of eastern Ghouta are still visible on commercial satellite platforms available to anyone with a browser. The city that survived 12,000 years of continuous habitation is in measurable portions of its footprint, a heap of ruins. The text said it would become so. The author wrote it when Damascus was the beating heart of the most powerful Aramean kingdom in the Levant, a city no contemporary observer would have imagined destroyed. The ruins are visible from orbit. The text is in Isaiah 17. The distance between them is 28 centuries and 0 explanations. Number 4. In January 2016, Dr. Timothy Furnish, a historian of Islamic and Middle Eastern eschatology and former professor at Georgia State University, published an analysis in the journal Orbis, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's quarterly, that mapped the geopolitical affiliations described in Ezekiel 38 and 39 against the military alliance structures of the early 21st century. The paper drew criticism from both theological and political science quarters. Theologians objected to treating prophetic literature as geopolitical projection. Political scientists objected to treating ancient texts as relevant data. Furnish's central methodology, however, was disarmingly straightforward. Take the coalition roster listed in Ezekiel 38. Apply the geographic identifications that biblical scholars have used since the 19th century. Plot them on a modern map. Then compare the result to the observable military and diplomatic alignments of the present decade. The text names them explicitly: Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, from the land of Magog; Persia; Cush; Put; Gomer; Beth Togarmah, from the uttermost north. Ezekiel 38 describes a coalition assembling from the far north. The Hebrew phrase Yerekite Zaphon translates as the uttermost parts of the north, that moves against the land of Israel in a period when Israel has been gathered from among the nations and is dwelling securely on its own land. The geographic identifications are not products of modern theological speculation. They trace to Wilhelm Gesenius, the 19th century German Hebraist whose Thesaurus Philologus remains a standard reference. Magog corresponds to the region north of the Black Sea and the Caucasus, territory now encompassing southern Russia and the Central Asian Turkic states. Meshech and Tubal map to regions in eastern Anatolia and the southern Caucasus, modern Turkey, Georgia, and Armenia. Persia is Iran. The identification is unambiguous and has never been contested. Cush corresponds to the Upper Nile region south of Egypt, modern Sudan, and in broader usage, the Horn of Africa, including Ethiopia and Eritrea. Put corresponds to the territories west of Egypt, modern Libya. Gomer maps to central and western Anatolia, again, modern Turkey. Beth Togarmah maps to the Armenian highlands and eastern Turkey. These identifications were established in the academic literature before any of the modern alliance patterns existed. They are not retrofitted. The alignment with present-day military deployments is what makes Furnish's paper difficult to dismiss as academic novelty. In September 2015, Russian military forces deployed to Syria for the first time since the Cold War, establishing a permanent airbase at Khmeimim and a naval facility at Tartus, placing Russian military assets approximately 200 kilometers from the Israeli border on the Golan Heights. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had been operating in Syria since at least 2012, with between 3,000 and 5,000 IRGC personnel deployed alongside Hezbollah forces in southern Lebanon and the Syrian Golan region. Turkey, though nominally a NATO member, deepened its military and economic relationship with Russia through the Turkstream pipeline agreement and the $2.5 billion purchase of Russia's S-400 missile defense system in 2017, a transaction so far outside NATO norms that the United States expelled Turkey from the F-35 fighter program in response. Sudan, under the government of Omar al-Bashir, accepted Russian military cooperation through the Wagner Group and signed agreements for a Russian naval base at Port Sudan on the Red Sea. Libya saw direct Russian military engagement through Wagner Group deployments, supporting the Libyan National Army beginning in 2019. The text describes a coalition composed of a power from the uttermost north, Persia, Anatolian entities, and North African territories, assembling in concert and moving from the north against a restored Israel. The modern map shows Russian, Iranian, and Turkish military forces physically positioned in Syria, north of Israel. Sudanese and Libyan governments have accepted Russian military cooperation. Israel exists as a restored nation-state, gathered from the nations inhabiting its own land, a condition that did not obtain when Ezekiel wrote and did not obtain again until 1948. The precondition the text specifies, gathered from the nations, dwelling securely, living in unwalled villages, is itself a prophecy that had to be fulfilled before the coalition scenario could become operative. The coalition alignment and the national restoration are not independent predictions. They are sequenced. The text specified the order held. The most unsettling dimension is not the alignment itself. It is the composition of the list. Ezekiel did not name Egypt, Israel's most frequent and geographically proximate adversary throughout biblical history. He did not name Assyria or Babylon, the dominant military threats of his own era, the empires that had already destroyed the northern and southern kingdoms. He did not name Edom, Moab, or Ammon, Israel's traditional border rivals. The nations the text omits are as instructive as the nations it includes. Egypt signed a peace treaty with Israel in 1979 and has maintained it for over 4 decades. Jordan signed a peace treaty in 1994. The nations Ezekiel excluded from the coalition are, in the modern era, the nations that made peace. The nations he included are, in the modern era, the nations that are operationally cooperating in military configurations north of the Israeli border. He named a set of nations that had no meaningful geopolitical relationship to one another in the 6th century BCE, that had no shared strategic interest in a restored Israel that did not yet exist, and that would not develop coordinated military postures for another 26 centuries. An exiled priest, writing in Babylon in approximately 570 BCE, a man with no intelligence apparatus, no diplomatic cables, no satellite reconnaissance, no predictive geopolitical modeling, produced a coalition roster that a 21st century defense analyst at a NATO planning table would recognize as an operationally plausible threat configuration. The text is in Ezekiel 38. The deployments are documented in open-source intelligence databases maintained by the International Institute for Strategic Studies and the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. The priest had no mechanism to generate the list. The list generated itself on the modern map without a single name requiring alteration. Number 3. In the winter of 2014, in a workshop on Misgav Ladak Street in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem's Old City, a metalsmith named Yuri Zur laid the final gold overlay on a 7-branched menorah that had consumed 3 years of his working life. The piece stood approximately 1.7 meters tall and weighed over 500 kilograms. It was cast in bronze, plated in gold to the specifications recorded in Exodus 25, 6 branches extending from a central shaft, each terminating in a cup shaped like an almond blossom, with knobs and flowers at prescribed intervals along each branch. Zur did not build it for exhibition. He built it to be carried into a room that does not yet exist, placed before a veil that has not yet been woven, in a structure that has not yet been raised on a platform, currently occupied by the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. The Temple Institute, founded in 1987 in the Old City of Jerusalem by Rabbi Yisrael Ariel, a former paratrooper who was among the first Israeli soldiers to reach the Western Wall during the 1967 Six-Day War, has spent more than 3 decades manufacturing the physical objects prescribed in the Hebrew Bible for the operation of a functioning Jewish temple. The project is not theoretical. It is not aspirational in the way that a vision statement is aspirational. It is an industrial and liturgical manufacturing operation with a growing inventory. As of 2024, the Institute has completed over 70 of the 102 ritual vessels and implements described across Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and the Talmudic tractates. Among them, the golden crown of the high priest, the tzitz, weighing approximately 1 kilogram, inscribed with the Hebrew words Kodesh Li-HWH, holy to the Lord, as specified in Exodus 28. The priestly garments, the ephod woven in gold, blue, purple, and scarlet, the breastplate set with 12 stones representing the 12 tribes, the robe of blue wool with alternating golden bells and pomegranate-shaped ornaments along its hem, have been produced by a team of textile specialists working from Talmudic measurements and dyeing protocols. The incense altar, overlaid in gold, has been completed. The copper laver for priestly washing has been constructed. The table of showbread, with its 12 loaves to be replaced weekly as described in Leviticus 2004, has been built and its accompanying vessels fabricated. Silver trumpets of the design described in Numbers 10 have been forged. The harps and lyres, specified for Levitical musical service, have been reconstructed from archaeological prototypes. In 2009, the Institute constructed a full-scale altar of burnt offering, assembled from unhewn natural stones, as specified in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 27. Both passages prohibit the use of cut or tooled stone for the altar. The altar was built to the dimensions recorded in the Talmudic tractate Midat, a square base of 5 cubits per side, 3 cubits in height, and was tested using controlled burning procedures to verify that the stone could sustain the sustained high temperatures required for animal sacrifice without fracturing. The test was successful. The altar is functional. Ezekiel 40 through 48, 9 consecutive chapters of detailed architectural and liturgical specification, provides the most comprehensive construction document for the temple found in any biblical text. The chapters describe exact dimensions for walls, gateways, inner and outer courts, the placement of the altar relative to the eastern gate, the water channel flowing from beneath the threshold, the allocation of priestly chambers, and the designation of restricted sacred zones. The Temple Institute's architectural division has produced 3-dimensional digital models, engineering drawings, and physical scale maquettes based on these specifications. Cross-referenced against the archaeological evidence from the Second Temple period documented by Professor Benjamin Mazar during his excavations along the southern and western walls of the Temple Mount between 1968 and 1978. But here's where the standard framing of this as religious extremism or messianic aspiration becomes genuinely difficult to sustain. The objects are not props. They are not scale models. They are operational ritual implements constructed to precise biblical specifications using historically appropriate materials and techniques. The garments are wearable. The vessels are functional. The altar has been stress tested. The menorah is gold-plated and dimensionally accurate, and the personnel infrastructure matches the material infrastructure. Since 2016, the Temple Institute has operated a formal training program for men identified through genealogical and genetic screening as patrilineal descendants of the Kohanim, the priestly caste. The trainees study the liturgical order of sacrificial service as described in the Talmudic tractate Yoma, the incense preparation protocol from the tractate Keratot, the Day of Atonement procedures described in Leviticus 16, and the spatial choreography of the priestly rotations specified in 1 Chronicles 24. The training is not academic. The men perform the physical motions of the service, the lifting, the carrying, the sprinkling, the prostration, in rehearsal spaces constructed to replicate temple proportions. They are practicing for a job that has not existed for 1,954 years. The vessels are not in a museum behind glass. They are in climate-controlled storage cases and display rooms within walking distance of the Temple Mount. The garments are folded, wrapped in acid-free linen, stored in humidity-regulated cabinets. The architectural plans are digitized, dimensioned, and engineering reviewed. The trainees continue their rotations on a weekly schedule. Ezekiel 44 specifies that the sons of Zadok, the faithful priestly sublineage, will minister in the restored temple. The men studying on Misgav Ladak Street believe they are those sons. The vessels they will carry have been built. The garments they will wear have been sewn. The altar they will serve has been tested and found structurally sound. The entire liturgical apparatus described across 4 books of the Torah and 9 chapters of Ezekiel, an apparatus that has not existed in operational form since Titus breached the walls of Jerusalem in the summer of 70 CE, sits in cases and closets and rehearsal rooms in the Old City, waiting for a building on a platform 30 meters away, behind a wall that is simultaneously the most contested and the most prayed at surface on earth. Number 2. On May 14, 1948, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, David Ben-Gurion stood in the main hall of the Tel Aviv Museum on Rothschild Boulevard and read the Israeli Declaration of Independence to an audience of approximately 250 people. The document was 979 words in Hebrew. The ceremony lasted 32 minutes. The Palestine Philharmonic played Hatikvah. 11 minutes after the ceremony ended, the United States issued de facto recognition. By midnight, the armies of Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq had crossed the borders. The state that had not existed for 1,878 years, not as a political entity, not as a sovereign territory, not as a functioning nation-state with borders, laws, a military, or a seat in any international body, was reborn in an afternoon in a museum. Under fluorescent lights, read into existence by a man born in Płonsk, Poland, and was at war before sunrise. There is no historical parallel for what occurred. Historians have searched for one. Political scientists have attempted to construct analogs. No model holds. Empires have fallen and risen, but along evolutionary lines, with successor states inheriting institutional infrastructure. Kingdoms have been conquered and reconquered, but by proximate populations who occupied the same geographic niche. Peoples have migrated, been absorbed, intermarried, and vanished into the demographic fabric of their host societies. The Etruscans are gone. The Phoenicians are gone. The Nabateans, the Edomites, the Moabites, absorbed beyond cultural recovery. Every dispersed people in recorded history either assimilated within a few centuries or maintained continuity only in isolated pockets. None reconstituted a sovereign state on the territory of their ancestors after a gap of 2 millennia. The demographic data is staggering in its improbability. Between 1882 and 1948, approximately 600,000 Jews immigrated to Mandatory Palestine from communities dispersed across more than 70 countries and speaking over 80 languages. After statehood, the ingathering accelerated into the most extraordinary demographic convergence in modern history. Ethiopian Jews were airlifted in Operation Moses in 1984 and Operation Solomon in 1991. 14,325 people evacuated in a single 36-hour airlift. Yemenite Jews were transported in Operation Magic Carpet between 1949 and 1950. Nearly 49,000 people, most of whom had never seen an airplane, flown from Aden to Tel Aviv. Over 1 million Jews emigrated from the Soviet Union between 1989 and 2006. Iraqi, Moroccan, Tunisian, Libyan, Indian, Bukharan, Argentine, South African, Iranian, and Kaifeng Chinese communities, all converging on a territory the size of New Jersey, on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, in the exact geographic location described in the founding texts of their tradition. The linguistic dimension alone defies historical precedent. Hebrew had not been a spoken vernacular language for approximately 1,700 years when Eliezer ben Yehuda, a Lithuanian-born lexicographer, arrived in Palestine in 1881 and began raising his son, Ben Zion, as the first native Hebrew speaker in modern history. The revival was considered quixotic by contemporary linguists. No dead language had ever been restored to full vernacular function. Latin persisted as a scholarly and liturgical language for centuries after the fall of Rome, and never revived as a mother tongue. Cornish, Manx, Gothic, Coptic, dead or nearly dead languages with revival attempts that stalled or remained confined to small communities of enthusiasts. Hebrew alone succeeded. It is now the daily language of over 9 million people, spoken in taxi cabs, on playgrounds, in hospital emergency rooms, in the Knesset, and on military radio frequencies. It is the only language in human history to have been dead as a vernacular, preserved exclusively in liturgical and literary form for 17 centuries, and then resurrected as a fully functional national language spoken by millions. Ezekiel 37, the vision of the valley of dry bones, describes the prophet being set down in a valley full of bones. The bones are very dry. The text emphasizes the completeness of death. These are not fresh remains. They are desiccated, scattered, and lifeless. Then the bones begin to move. They reassemble. Bone connects to bone. Sinew appears. Flesh covers the sinew. Skin encloses the flesh. But there is no breath in them. They are anatomically complete, but not alive. Then breath enters from the four winds, and the bodies stand as a vast, living army. The passage does not leave the interpretation open. Ezekiel 37:11 explicitly states, "These bones are the whole house of Israel." The prophecy describes a nation that is completely dead, not diminished, not exiled, not weakened, but dead as a coherent national entity, and then reconstituted from its scattered remains into a living body. The metaphorical architecture of the passage maps onto the demographic record with a precision that resists comfortable dismissal. A nation destroyed by Rome in 70 CE. Its temple burned, its capital razed and rebuilt as a Roman colony. Its population killed, enslaved, and dispersed across the extent of the empire. Its sovereignty annihilated. Not for a generation, not for a century, but for nearly 2 millennia. Its language dead as a spoken tongue. Its people scattered across every continent. Then, within a single century, bones to sinew, sinew to flesh, flesh to skin, breath to body. Immigration waves from 70 nations, a dead language revived, a territory reclaimed, a state declared, recognized, defended, and functioning. No political scientist operating in 1800 would have predicted it. No demographer working in 1900 would have considered it plausible. No model of national formation in any school of political science or historical sociology contains a mechanism that explains the reconstitution of a national entity after a dispersion of this duration across this geographic range, with this degree of cultural preservation. The text in Ezekiel 37 was composed approximately 2,600 years ago by a priest in Babylonian exile who had personally witnessed the destruction of his own nation and the deportation of his people. Standing in the wreckage of everything he knew, he described a restoration that every contemporary observer would have dismissed as impossible. 26 centuries later, the bones assembled. The nation that was dead holds a seat in the United Nations General Assembly. The language that was dead is spoken by 9 million people in traffic jams and bedtime stories and Supreme Court rulings. The text described a demographic impossibility. The impossibility occurred. No framework currently available in the historical, political, or social sciences accounts for the mechanism by which it occurred. The bones stood up. The breath entered. The nation lives. The text has not been amended. The event has not been explained. Number 1. In 1997, Dr. Carl Skorecki was attending Sabbath services at a synagogue in Toronto when a man with the surname Cohen was called to the Torah for the first Aliyah, the opening reading traditionally reserved for members of the Kohanim, the patrilineal descendants of Aaron, the brother of Moses. Skorecki, a professor of nephrology and genetics at the Technion Israel Institute of Technology in Haifa, and a practicing Cohen himself, found himself watching the man approach the Bima and asking a question that bridged his two professional worlds. If the Kohanim were truly a patrilineal caste descending from a single male ancestor, as described in the text, and if that lineage had been maintained with fidelity across approximately 3,300 years of diaspora, persecution, exile, forced conversion, pogrom, and cultural assimilation, then the Y chromosome would show it. The Y chromosome passes from father to son with minimal recombination. It is, in genetic terms, a patrilineal receipt. The priestly claim was either a social convention maintained by cultural inertia, or it was a biological fact inscribed in the genome. The chromosome would know which. Skorecki contacted Dr. Michael Hammer, a population geneticist at the University of Arizona's Division of Biotechnology, who had been developing Y chromosome haplotyping methodologies for forensic and genealogical applications. Together, they designed a study that was elegant in its simplicity. Collect Y chromosome samples from Jewish men with the priestly tradition, self-identified Kohanim, and from Jewish men without it, across multiple geographically and culturally distinct communities. If the priestly designation were purely social, a surname convention, a family tradition, a cultural title with no biological anchor, the Y chromosome profiles of Kohanim and non-Kohanim would be statistically indistinguishable. If the designation reflected an actual patrilineal bottleneck, a single common ancestor from whom all Kohanim descend, a shared haplotype signature should appear at elevated frequency in the priestly population and be detectably absent or rare in the general Jewish male population. They collected samples from 306 Jewish men across Israel, North America, and the United Kingdom, 188 men with the priestly tradition and 118 without. The sample population included both Ashkenazi Jews, whose communities had been centered in Central and Eastern Europe for roughly 1,000 years, and Sephardi Jews, whose communities had been dispersed across the Mediterranean basin, North Africa, and the Middle East. The two populations had been geographically separated, culturally distinct, liturgically divergent in practice, though not in core identity, and reproductively isolated from one another for over a millennium. If the Cohen designation were merely a surname, a cultural convention that accumulated independently in different communities, the Y chromosome data would reflect that independence. The haplotypes would be different. The results were published in Nature in January 1997. They were not ambiguous. A specific Y chromosome haplotype, subsequently designated the Cohen modal haplotype, or CMH, appeared at dramatically elevated frequencies in self-identified Kohanim in both populations. Among Ashkenazi Kohanim, the haplotype appeared in approximately 69% of samples. Among Sephardi Kohanim, 61%. Among non-Kohanim Jewish males, including Levites, Israelites, and converts, The frequency was approximately 15%. Two populations separated by 1,000 years of independent demographic history, living on different continents, speaking different languages, practicing different cultural norms, and carrying the same Y chromosome signature at nearly identical elevated rates. The statistical probability of this distribution arising by chance, in the absence of a genuine shared patrilineal ancestor, was calculated at less than 1 in 10,000. A follow-up study led by Hammer and published in 2009 in the journal Human Genetics refined the analysis using extended Y chromosome short tandem repeat markers. The most recent common ancestor of the Cohen modal haplotype carriers was estimated at approximately 3,190 years before present, with a 95% confidence interval spanning from roughly 2,650 to 3,700 years before present. The biblical narrative places Aaron, the first high priest, the elder brother of Moses, the inaugurator of the priesthood, in the 13th century BCE, approximately 3,300 years ago. The genetic dating and the textual dating converge within the same statistical window. The scale of what the chromosome records becomes comprehensible only when the historical context is laid beside it. The Kohanim have no territory. They have no central institution, no governing body, no regulatory mechanism. They have had no functioning temple, the operational basis of their entire caste identity, since 70 CE, when Titus Flavius Vespasianus breached the walls of Jerusalem and burned the Second Temple to its foundation stones. In the 1,954 years since that fire, the priestly line has survived the Roman diaspora, the Bar Kokhba revolt and its aftermath, the Visigothic persecutions, the Crusades, the expulsion from England in 1290, the expulsion from France in 1306, the Black Death pogroms, the expulsion from Spain in 1492, the Inquisition, the Chmielniki massacres, the Russian pogroms, the Farhud in Baghdad, and the systematic industrial murder of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. At every one of those inflection points, at every massacre, every forced conversion, every displacement, every generation in which a son might have been lost, hidden, or raised under a false identity, the patrilineal chain could have been broken. A single generation of interrupted transmission would have diluted the genetic signal beyond recovery. The Y chromosome data shows that it was not broken. Across more than 100 generations, across 5 continents, through every catastrophe the Jewish people endured, the patrilineal signal did not dilute. It did not scatter into background noise. It persisted, replicating from father to son with a fidelity that geneticists at the University of Arizona calculated as statistically anomalous against any model of random drift over a time span of this length. Dr. Abshalom Zusman Diskin of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem published a 2006 critique in the journal Science, arguing that the Cohen modal haplotype may reflect common ancestral Levantine male line genetics rather than descent from a single priestly progenitor. The critique is methodologically respectable. It does not, however, account for the frequency differential. If the CMH were merely a background feature of Levantine Y chromosome diversity, a common haplotype that happens to appear in the region, it should appear at similar rates across all Levantine-descended male populations, priestly or not. It does not. The elevation is specific to men who carry the priestly tradition. The tradition and the chromosome track together, across 3 millennia and 5 continents, in 2 populations that had no contact with each other for 1,000 years. Numbers 3 prescribes the separation of the tribe of Levi, and within it, the sons of Aaron, from the general Israelite population, assigning them specific liturgical duties that no other lineage may perform. Ezekiel 44 narrows the specification further. Only the sons of Zadok, a sub-lineage within the Kohanim who remained faithful when others strayed, will serve in the restored temple. For either prescription to be operationally fulfillable, the patrilineal genetic signature of the priestly caste would need to survive, intact and statistically identifiable, through every century of exile that lay between the composition of the text and the moment when the temple service might resume. The text does not merely predict the continuation of a social custom. It predicates the resumption of temple service on the preservation of a biological lineage, a genetic reality that could only be verified by technologies that would not exist for another 25 centuries. The Temple Institute in Jerusalem is now incorporating Y chromosome analysis into its screening process for men entering the priestly training program. The genetic marker that any population geneticist would have expected to dissolve into statistical background noise.